All right, welcome back for another week of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association podcast. I'm Eric Weisseth.
And I'm Jack Hurdy.
All right, we'll jump in here. So, couple of things. It's been a minute. We didn't do anything last week because we were on the road and whatnot. But a couple weeks ago, we attended, or I guess I attended, the Salmon Chapter meeting up in Salmon, Idaho. And it was awesome. It was a great day of meetings. We, had sort of a river focus section and a hunt focus section. We talked a lot about allocation, of course, because if you get hunt outfitters together, that's what you have to do. It's kind of like a rule. But really, really good meeting. Fish and Game came, had some great presentations on just what's kind of going on biologically up there. And overall, just like an awesome day. Oh, and Aaron showed up, America Outdoors showed up and gave a, awesome presentation on Explore and fees and everything coming along with that. And the Forest Service showed up and did that. And then, so it was a great meeting during the day. And then I think the thing that for me personally was just awesome was the Salmon Chapter banquet that night. It was just a super cool party. It was really awesome to just get in a room with a ton of outfitters and guides. And I don't know, it was just really fun to remember how rad this community is and hanging out with them. They give scholarships, like the Salmon Chapter raises money every year and then gives scholarships with it. And so we got to hear from the scholarship recipients, which was awesome. And they gave some awards. They gave an award to Brad Compton for his service on the licensing board, which was just really, really meaningful. And then they gave, I don't remember exactly what it is, some kind of a lifetime membership or the exact title of it, but award to Jeff and Deb Bitten for their, what they've given to the industry. And that was also just a really moving moment and awesome to see, because I don't know that there's probably a single person in Idaho who's given more to the industry overall than Jeff and Deb Bitten. Jeff is,
we got
amazing.
to get Jeff to come on the podcast and tell some stories about the good old days.
For sure. I mean, his guide license is like in the 30s somewhere. Like it's literally like 37 or something. Like it's crazy. But that was really meaningful. And overall, it was a great reminder for me, like why I love this industry so much. Just incredible people who love what they do, love sharing the wild, cool places of Idaho with people and building a life around that, and who probably sacrifice a lot of other opportunities to be able to do that as their life. And it was awesome. So way to go, Salmon Chapter. You're an example for the rest of us. And it was just a lot of fun. So that was a lot of fun. All right, let's move on to legislative update. This one's super fun. So, Jack, you want to get into a few of the things that have happened over the last couple weeks?
Yeah, so legislature's wrapping up right now. The committees are pretty much done, for the most part, at least the ones relevant to us. Seems like they're trying to get out of here by the end of this week, although we'll see, because they said that last week. A couple things have been going through the last couple weeks. First is the Senate bill, I believe it was 1326, rescinding the open fields doctrine. So we talked about this, I think, on the last podcast, but the open fields doctrine is basically a legal theory that conservation officers are able to go onto open fields, not someone's house, but there's private fields, to do law enforcement for wildlife, because wildlife's a public trust resource. It's this big loophole to have if you can't effectively enforce the law around wildlife on private lands. The state legislature decided that they didn't like that. They saw it as a violation of people's civil liberties. There was a lot of concerns about farmers. It sounds like maybe there's a few people at the department that had been abusing this privilege. And so the legislature is rescinding that doctrine. I think the real, we have some concerns about this bill. One is that it's going to make it harder for COs to do their jobs. They had some really interesting examples. Fish and Game shared some really interesting examples of conservation officers, enforcing not only wildlife law, but also trespassing law, and actually protecting private property from people going on and fishing or hunting illegally. The bill also imposes a civil liability, personal civil liability on conservation officers, which is pretty unprecedented and unique for law enforcement. So that means if a conservation officer violates this restriction, whether intentionally or accidentally, they could be held personally liable and have to pay $1,000 per violation. So I think, on the one hand, it's good to protect civil liberties, and private property rights are very important and foundational to this country in a lot of ways. On the other hand, we definitely have some concerns that this could create poaching islands, and that it's going to make it really, really hard and discourage a lot of COs from doing any kind of law enforcement when it comes to private land. So yeah, well, I think we'll see. I'm sure we'll see what happens here. There's been some big stories in the news recently about poaching on private property. So yeah, we'll see where that goes. Another bill that was up, this one had a more positive outcome, was HB 861. And what this bill would have done was basically taken the funding pool that IOGA and a lot of other organizations apply for, and opened it up to allow state universities to apply for it. This funding pool comes from the bed occupancy tax, and it goes to fund marketing tourism, right? So basically, it's something that it's a program that funds itself. It creates a virtuous cycle where the more people they bring into the state to stay in hotels and motels and campgrounds, the more money goes into that program, which funds more marketing, and it grows, not only the program, but also Idaho's tourism economy, of which IOGA is an important part of. This bill would have allowed Boise State, University of Idaho, public universities to apply for that funding as well. And, we definitely support funding for higher education. It's good to have, public universities that are well funded. But we really felt like this was not the appropriate mechanism for that. On the one hand, you're putting a 3-person nonprofit like IOGA in competition with multi-billion-dollar institutions for grant money. The grant money is now going to something that it's not intended for. And, we were worried that it would, hurt the state's economy, because tourism is such a competitive industry. We're not just competing with ourselves in the state. We're competing with other states. We're competing with other countries to bring visitors to Idaho. And so we felt like pulling that money out, using it for a purpose that it was not intended for, was going to shrink that pie altogether. Fortunately, I was able to go kind of last minute and testify against this bill. The committee ultimately, I think, liked what I had to say and had some of their own reservations about it, and they voted the bill down. So it was good to kind of put a stop to that, to protect some of this really important program, Visit Idaho and Idaho Travel Council, that have been so impactful for our industry. Yeah, quite a rush killing a bill, I'll tell you. It's good adrenaline.
Yeah, Jack, you did a great job going down there presenting. We heard from all sorts of people in the tourism space how appreciative they were of IOGA and of Jack going down, because he ended up being the only person that presented on this, because this came up really fast. And I was in Salmon, so I sort of explained this is just more my space than it has been Jack's, and so kind of explained where the concepts were. And Jack was able to pinch hit at the very last minute, because I was hoping to do it remote and then had to change our mind. And anyway, he jumped in and knocked it out of the park, and we shut this bill down. And it would have been really harmful. Like, it would have meant potentially a significant impact to the budget of Visit Idaho and to those that get ITC grants. And ultimately, they think Visit Idaho, that's the 3,100. It is the people out there advocating for and creating discovery for people to realize Idaho's a place to come. Like, we as businesses do that, but they do it on a larger scale with more sort of discovery at a high level to make people realize how rad the state is. And if we don't have them, it would have a massive impact on tourism. Like, every dollar they don't spend will be fewer dollars in outfitters' pockets. And so this was a huge threat we saw to the industry, and Jack went in there and, yeah, killed it. And killing a bill is a cool feeling. So way to go, Jack.
Yep.
It's kind of wild. You're sitting there like, holy moly, I just stopped a law. That's amazing.
Yep. Just a guy with a notebook.
Yeah, right. Pretty cool. All right. So kind of moving through big game tech rules. That's been one we've been watching and has been super controversial. It passed through Senate Resources Committee. I can't remember if we talked about it on the pod. Like, that was a wild deal how that happened, but it got through Senate Resources Committee sort of against all expectations. And then the House committee hearing was also a wild ride. Like, it was like, holy moly, is this going to pass? And then, oh no, this is definitely not going to pass. And then it went on for quite a while, going back and forth and ping-ponging, and was, for those that are into that kind of thing, like a pretty good time. And they ended up holding it because all of a sudden somebody started talking about how there's a potentially bill language floating out there that actually does tech stuff and solves the problem. And so they stopped and held it. And then at the last minute, this was last week, HB 939 shows up, which it does what the rules were mostly doing, but in a statute form. And so the statute says, amongst other things, but sort of the germane parts, and I'm just going to read it because I think it's easier that way. No person shall use any of the following technologies for hunting or scouting big game animals or game birds from August 30th through December 31st of each calendar year. Thermal imaging technology, night vision technology, transmitting trail cameras on land owned by the federal government, the state of Idaho, or a local government within the state, or drone aircraft or any other unmanned aircraft systems. And then it goes on to say, shall not apply, meaning like the stuff above, shall not apply to the use of such technologies for hunting wolves, mountain lions, or predatory wildlife, as that term is defined in section 36201, Idaho Code, yada, yada, yada. Monitoring, preventing, or controlling damage to livestock or other domestic animals or crops by the owner thereof, an owner, authorized representative, or leasee, or a federal or state agency. And then kind of winding it down, won't apply to retrieving wounded game animals or game birds, monitoring buildings or personal property for the deterrence of theft, or monitoring traps. So it really tackles, the issue that everybody's kind of seen around being the last state that allows a lot of this technology. So it does tackle that while getting away from I think the concerns people had around wanting to be able to still use them for predator hunting and, pursuing wounded animals and that kind of thing. Last we saw, this, I think, it looks like it's going to happen. So it's gone all the way through the House and it's sitting on, I think, as of yesterday, the third reading in the Senate. And we have every expectation that this is going to pass. So a wild turn of events on this one.
Yep. And I think we landed in a pretty good place. Obviously, the legislation isn't as strong as the rules, but it does address a lot of the like real big concerns that we had heard from folks on it. I think this is going to be a continuing conversation. We're probably going to be back again next year talking about more hunting technology, rules and legislation because, enforcement is going to be challenging and there's always things you got to adjust. But I think having this on the books is good. And most people are going to want to follow the law. So
yeah, I think there's going to be some interesting conversations around enforcement on parts of this. And, it also doesn't deal with the smart scopes thing, which I think is on people's radar. Compared to where we expected this to be, I think, 3 months ago, this is a pretty interesting turn of events. And for those who are sort of into watching the wild actions of the legislature, this has been a wild ride and kind of fun. But yeah, so that's where that is today. And so we expect to see that go all the way through. Otherwise, I think that's kind of the end of the legislative season. Like we expect it to wind down this week. I know some people were thinking last week, although that didn't seem very likely, but all signs point towards it being pretty realistic for the end of this week. So that'll be the end. All right, moving on to oh yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say one more thing and just close the loop on this. But last week or last time on the podcast, we talked about SJM 111, which was the basically resolution asking Congress to keep public lands in public hands. That passed through the House committee and it passed on the floor of the House. It is officially, it's not law, but it is a valid resolution or a valid joint memorial and stating the position of the legislature that we think public lands should stay public and we value public lands for all these different reasons, including outdoor recreation. So it's good to see that pass and hopefully people will take notice.
It is a nice, strongly worded letter that we're sending to the the federal representatives. But to be
Yeah.
honest, like as it, official statement of Idaho is public lands, public hands is pretty awesome. Pretty cool place to be. So, all right, just a few other things we wanted to get to. The Salmon Chalice, if you operate on the Salmon Chalice, and especially if you're, someone who participates in their fee offset program, they have put a temporary hold on that program for 2026, just based on some changes in fees and everything else that, people have been following with the Explore Act. That's kind of a evolving situation and, more updates will come. But for the moment, they're kind of putting a soft hold on that just to sort of see what happens here as people choose what fee structure they're going to go from. So it has the potential to make a, non insignificant financial impact on the Salmon Chalice. And so they're just being cautious, which makes sense.
So another Forest Service news, they are relaxing the requirements for permits to film on Forest Service lands. And if you've been paying attention to the Explore Act, this is, they're basically getting in alignment with the Explore Act. So the new rule will allow for anyone filming with less than 5 individuals. And I did a little research, and it's individuals refers to the number of people filming. So if you have less than 5 people filming, no authorization, permit, or fees may be required. If you have 6 to 8 individuals, they'll issue a de minimis authorization, which they should have a website. Basically, just it's like a self-issue permit. Just fill out a form on the website. And if you have more than that, more than 8 individuals, they will require a permit and fee. Phlegm and interior as a whole are probably not going to require the de minimis authorization. So if you have less than 8 people, you probably won't need any paperwork. It does sound like, at least for the Forest Service, that wilderness areas will still need additional authorization. So that's something they haven't released the specifics of that yet. But if you have any doubts about this, regardless of where you're operating, whether it's wilderness or not, definitely get in contact with your local manager. Make sure you know the rules. This has been kind of a thing for a long time, especially as social media has become more prominent and outfitters want to get content. You just want to make sure that you're not going to be violating the terms of your permits. Definitely worth having that conversation there. But seems to be a pretty good thing for outfitters overall, and able to get like that photographer on your trip to get some good content for you and your social media manager.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, and I mean, I think that leaves a lot of space for a lot of things. Like when we filmed the 3100, I don't think they had 8 people filming, and that was, a relatively significant project. I mean, granted, it was in wilderness, so there'd still be some additional things there, but pretty cool to streamline that because I know over the years when I was an outfitter or working with just different things that people were trying to do, that was always this big thing that was floating out there, and how it was handled per forest was so different. Everything else. So wonderful to see that get streamlined.
Hmm.
All right. So let's see, just a few other things. Last week, there was an Idaho Fish and Game Commission held a quarterly meeting. At the meeting, our main point of interest that we were watching was the presentation from Fish and Game on allocation and the kind of history and context of allocation by Rick Ward, I think with some support from Brad Compton. Rick did a great job giving a robust, but, if brief-ish presentation on the full history and context of allocation. Just overall, it was, I thought, really good information and, was explained why allocation is important and why under our system, our unique system of operating areas and everything else, it really just makes a lot of sense. Something it was great, but that's that was the big thing. I think one of the other things, we did have a few members get up and talk about allocation and their history, specifically Jeff, who was there from kind of the beginning. And then they also did kind of recognize Brad Compton for his service on the licensing board, which was great.
Yep. Yeah. So we've been kind of teasing this a little bit, but we finally launched the report we've been working on with BHA and Idaho Wildlife Federation and Idaho Business for the Outdoors. Steve Peterson was the economist that put it together. And that report is now public. So we will include a link to that in the upcoming newsletter. And we also spent some time kind of filming some videos and some audio out in the Boise foothills with our partners talking about public land and talking about the reports. We'll be following up with some more social media and stuff. So keep an eye out for that. Yeah, overall, I think the report's really strong, and I hope everyone at least skims the executive summary because there's some really good information in there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
It
you
was
want me
a
to?
really cool report. Yeah, another thing that's happened here that we'll just give an update on is a couple weeks ago, the licensing board, IOGLB, had one of their quarterly meetings, pretty short meeting, not a lot of big things going on. I think the biggest thing that's worth noting was it was the final meeting for the person who has been chairman of the board, Brad Compton, for a long time. And Tammy Overacker stepped in. She's been the VP and sort of I believe the hunt rep on the board, and she stepped into that chair position and did a great job in her first meeting. But being Brad's last meeting, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but Brad will be absolutely missed on that board. He has been a great supporter of the industry as the Fish and Game representative, someone who's been around a long time, really understands it, appreciates it, thinks that we bring value to the community and everything else. And he'll be a really hard person to replace. So we're looking forward to seeing who that is and when they come onto the board. But Brad, we'll miss you. Absolutely. But all right. So moving on to announcements and just some upcoming events. Next week is the Nez Clear Outfitters meeting with the Forest Service. So that's April 7th in Orofino. So if you're an outfitter on the Nez Clear, that meeting is for you. There's going to be a bunch of things. Licensing board folks will be there. Fish and Game will be there. We'll be there. All sorts of stuff. So if you're an outfitter in that area, make sure you attend that meeting. That's on April 7th, so next Tuesday. April 6th in the afternoon, North Idaho chapter of IOGA is going to be hosting an allocation meeting. So if you're a hunt outfitter up in that neck of the woods, we'll be hosting a meeting where we're going to talk about everything that's been happening with allocation stuff and kind of the ongoing conversations with Fish and Game about recalculation, etc. So that'll be in the afternoon on the 6th. The details on that are coming out. We're hopefully confirming the location today. So by the time you hear this, you should have gotten an email with the exact location, but know that that is going to be the afternoon of the 6th for the allocation meeting, and then sort of a social dinner hangout thing that night on the 6th. Moving down to some other things coming up. The Salmon Chapter is having their big fundraiser next Thursday, so April 9th at the Salmon Select Sale. This is, I believe, the International Championship of Wolf Howling, along with just like a bunch of other things that go on that night, bands and stuff. If you've never been, this is a cool event. Like, I promise you, you have not been to something like this. It is a singular experience and it's awesome. The Salmon Chapter, like, they cook a bunch of food and have kind of a cool deal where they're raising money. This is a big part of how they raise money for their scholarships and everything else. So if you are anywhere near salmon next week, this is an event you absolutely want to come and check out and hang out and spend some money to support the Salmon Chapter.
I'm really excited. Eric's gonna let me go, so
It's cool. I remember when I first heard about it, I was like, it's the what? What am I going to? And yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like what you'd expect, but it's also super rad. Yeah, it's a good time. The other thing happening next week is the IOGA spring board meeting. The board meeting is the 9th and 10th and will be held at Wilderness River Outfitters there in Salmon. Any IOGA member is welcome to come and sit in, except for the portions where the board goes into executive session, which are pretty minor. But you're free to come and just sort of check out and hear what's going on. If you're really interested in self-abuse and can't make it to Salmon, we will also have a Zoom option so you can listen in online, which does not sound fun to me, but if that's something you're interested in, we will post that link somewhere at some point. I'm not exactly sure where yet, and as I was writing this, I realized I really need a solution for that problem. But we'll probably try and get it out in a newsletter that's coming out later this week, and we'll post it on the website somewhere on a calendar page that is yet to be built. But will hopefully be by maybe the end of the week. Moving down, the Lower Salmon Outfitters meeting was supposed to be on April 13th. And yep, if you're one of those Lower Salmon Outfitters, you heard me right. That meeting is getting moved. The governor's office has decided at somewhat the last minute to host what is probably the biggest conference on outdoor recreation in the state's modern history. And that is going to be April 13th. That we've been asked to, it sounds like most likely be contributors to a panel. And there's just a bunch of other things. And it's something that we believe that IOGA needs to be present at. And so that Lower Salmon Outfitter meeting is going to get moved from the 13th to most likely the 16th. We're confirming the meeting location is available on the 16th. Really sorry about that change, but we do feel like it's in probably everybody's best interest to make that move. So if you're a Lower Salmon Outfitter, you will be getting an email about this hopefully today or tomorrow at the latest by the time you're hearing this. And that meeting will be moved from the 13th to the 16th. So I believe that's from Monday to Thursday, the same week. So not a huge change in when, a little bit different. And then Jack, you want to talk about the last one here on upcoming events?
yeah. So Red Side River Rendezvous. It's in Salmon this year, May 15th through the 17th. We'll be there. IOJ is the sponsor of this event. Obviously, I mean, if you guys have been to the Rendezvous in the past, which hopefully everyone has, it's a fantastic time. You get to hang out with all your friends pre-season before they disappear onto other launch dates and get to buy a bunch of cool stuff. And you get to watch myself and Mark Martin present on Middle Fork salmon, the state that they're in, and how to be a good advocate for them. So yeah, hope to see everybody there. Eric, you're going to be there?
I
The
will.
whole
Yep.
IOGA crew will be.
I think the whole IOGA crew is going to be there, and we're excited to just kind of hang out, talk to guides. If you're curious about what IOGA does and how you can get more involved and everything else, we'll be there to have those conversations. So really looking forward to it. It's an awesome event. If you're an Idaho guide and you haven't been, you should figure out a way to make sure you make it on this one. So good time. All right, Jack, you want to tell us about who the interview is with
Yeah.
this week?
So I was able to sit down with Carly Knudsen. A lot of folks probably know Carly. She's from Salmon, been a guide for a long time, but she's now in a PhD program at the University of Utah. And she's done some really cool research on guide resilience, health and wellness in the guiding space. Some pretty unique stuff. And it's cool because there's just not a lot of academic research on it, even though a lot of what she covers, I think, is kind of stuff that makes sense if you've been a guide or an outfitter and you understand the lifestyle. So we kind of go through some of that stuff. Carly talks about her research, about her life growing up and how she got into guiding and all these things. So yeah, definitely worth a listen. And Carly's super sharp, and hopefully everyone enjoys the interview.
Awesome. Well, without further ado, here is Jack and Carly.
Carly Knudsen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
How's it going? You're in Salt Lake City, right?
Yep. So I'm in the big city. Yep.
Cool. Awesome, Carly. Well, for folks that don't know you, do you mind kind of telling us a bit about your background here? And
Yeah, how I got here. For sure. So I guess a little bit about me in the guiding world. I grew up in Salmon, Idaho, which is probably most of your listeners are aware of, is a pretty big river hub of the world. I was pretty lucky of my parents moved there and they're a classic family, didn't necessarily know they were going to stay there. My dad worked for the BLM as a wildland firefighter. So got an assignment there and I thought they were going to be there a couple of years, which is like the classic story. And then found out there was steelhead fishing downtown and kind of
nice.
never left, which is great. But yeah, so was kind of just like ingrained in that world and didn't necessarily know how special it was until I left. But had a lot of really close family friends who were multi-day outfitters, mostly on the main and the middle fork of the Salmon. So got to grow up kind of going on those rivers and learning to ducky and learning to swim in rivers. Like that's always just been like a huge part of my upbringing. Yeah, then started guiding just because it was like the cool thing to do. It's like kind of just in
Yep.
Salmon. It's funny, it's just like what people did as their high school job. I never really thought too much of it. I was on pretty different trajectory in college. I was studying mostly psychology and exercise science kind of field. And I think many of our stories didn't think I would be still guiding 12 years later, whatever, how many years
Yeah.
it's been. But yeah, and yeah, it's always just been a big part of my life. But then now I kind of ended up in grad school in parks, recreation, and tourism. So something that is pretty aligned, I'd say, with the guiding world.
hmm
But yeah, I can share, I guess, a little bit more about that as we keep talking. But that's kind of how I ended up in Salt Lake, at least for now.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty cool, I think, to get to grow up in the guiding and outfitting world and to kind of, I mean, almost live it at the center of the rafting side of things. Although I know some people in Riggins that would definitely disagree with that.
Yeah.
Um, that's pretty cool. Where would you get guide before? I can't remember if you said.
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up kind of in our backyard, so mostly on
hmm
the main Salmon to start. Our close family friend had companies on the main. Idaho Adventures, shout out,
Nice.
was where I started out. But yeah, I kind of got to skip the whole day guiding scene of for better or for worse. I didn't even necessarily know that there was like this kind of stepping stone that most folks get to until like I eventually started working on the middle fork with the company I work for now, and like that always seemed cool, but I didn't necessarily know that once I started working with other guides that have been like I've been working my whole career like on the way up to like try to work here or whatever else.
Yep.
So but yeah, I was lucky that was my backyard. So
Cool. And then you went on to study. You said kind of was it exercise science and psychology? And then you're now in
hmm
parks, rec, and tourism. So I would imagine there's a pretty good kind of through line from guiding to those subjects. Can you
yeah,
talk
for
about that a little
sure.
bit?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, being a rural kid, like the river's there, but also like sports ends up being a really big thing of, like I joked about, like, I didn't know the river was necessarily that cool. Like I wanted to be a sports kid and I wanted to have a mall and do all that good stuff. And so, that's where I found a lot of joy in high school. And so kind of thought I wanted to go down, specifically like sports psychology. So I kind of have some overlap with like the intersections between like physical health and athletics, and kind of some of like the mental aspects of that and how those two kind of intersect. And yeah, as I went to school, I got a really cool opportunity working with a rehabilitation center that mostly worked with folks with chronic illness and disabilities, and that kind of expanded my world even further of like what does health kind of mean and look like to different people in different contexts, and kind of how complicated health can actually be. And I loved just like tearing apart kind of like that in general. But yeah, I didn't necessarily, I always loved school. I'm like a total nerd. That was also a thing that I've like since ever. I'm like, I love learning. I love asking questions. And I thought I wanted to do a PhD kind of on that more psychology side of things, but I didn't love like how prescriptive it necessarily felt, or like that they're very focused on, you know, like diagnosis and illness and like the biomedical kind of like side of things. And I love social science. I started doing research like in my or in my undergrad. But you know, and then like I said, as like guiding was kind of this separate thing that felt very distinct, I guess, from that world, especially when I was kind of in more of the health psychology and disability studies world. But I didn't necessarily find my home in that side of things. And so I took like 5 years off after my undergrad and was kind of really searching for a way to kind of start combining my personal interests with kind of my more academic side, I say. And I happened to get involved. And so I was looking for organizations, I guess, along that way that felt like they were making those connections. And so I guess it's probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago now, I started getting involved with the Red Side Foundation, which I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with and you'll chat more with later, but provides a lot of health services specifically to guides, which I felt like had some cool overlap with some of that like athletics and sports psychology kind of side of things with my own experiences. And I started volunteering on a board that was called River Discovery, which is a cool organization that basically puts on trips for folks that have experienced cancer and their support systems. And the company I work for now's parents helped found that organization. So started kind of initially getting in that world like in more experiential ways, and then was kind of just out there once I decided I want to go back to school, like what field is actually like doing work in this space. And it was like harder to find than I thought. It was like nature, health, you know, like all this stuff that like totally makes sense in my brain, but didn't find that space in like the health psychology world. And so I accidentally ended up finding parks, recreation, and tourism as a graduate study. And and like all the funny cliches of people think I'm going to graduate school to become a park ranger, become Leslie Knope, you know, which I was like, you know, that'd be a lot easier than what I'm going through. So I hope I don't need a PhD to become a park ranger, but who knows?
I something you said I think kind of resonated with me, or maybe this connection something you were saying is I've always felt like being at least a river guide where you're kind of with this big group, it feels like a team sport, you know, like it's a job and you're guiding, but at the same time, like it is very athletic and you kind of feel like you're getting the ball down the field every day. So it's funny to hear that, I think, in what you're saying, like we're interested in team sports and athletics and also in guiding, kind of found a way to bring sports psychology a bit into the world of guiding. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and that's where what's interesting is that's where it started, I guess. But I'd say like as, you know, my career and life in the guiding world's developed, and kind of um my focus and kind of conceptions of that has also expanded. So I'd say like started probably more on that like sports athletics, like team kind of side of things. And then like as I've progressed, I definitely like also think about like, I mean, nature and like the environment side of things. And I was also like looking for, you know, as guides or as the folks that were bringing down these trips, there's like all these health benefits we can chat more about, but there's also like this very big environmental piece that like I feel like also like we're giving back to or should be giving back to, like and thinking about like health as a whole ecosystem. And that definitely wasn't necessarily like where at least I consciously like originally started my career. So
Yeah.
so yes, and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So you've done, I think, the reason we started chatting about this kind of stuff, you did a research project on guide wellness and resilience, right? Or is that for your master's, right?
Yeah, it was a part, technically it was separate from my
Okay,
thesis. It was just a bonus project, but yeah, it
cool.
was during my master's degree. Yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a bit about that? Because you touched on that a little bit, like all the emotional and physical benefits of guiding, and then there can be
Mhm.
emotional and physical, I think, costs is maybe a way to frame it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I got involved with the Red Side Foundation pretty early, I'd say, in my career of guiding. And so for the listeners that don't know, I'm sure you'll chat more about, provide free health and wellness services to guides.
Mhm.
So some of that includes mental health counseling, but also connections to scholarships and resources and opportunities and things like that. But kind of through that connection with my specific research at the University of Utah, I was in a class I was thinking about community engagement. So in research, I'd say there's kind of different buckets of research. Like I'm already in a weird bucket of I'm in social science, which studies basically like people using psychology and sociology. And then within that, you can kind of do forms of research that I think a lot of people not in research kind of think of research as, of kind of just doing projects that are somewhat extractive and kind of just like they'd say like sit in the institutions or only benefit the researchers are the only ones that get to read them and care about the topics. And that's definitely not why I got into graduate school. I always wanted to make sure the work that I'm doing is very grounded in community and grounded in some sort of specific outcome and change. And so community engaged research is basically a specific type that really encourages researchers to work with communities in like all phases of the research process of both identifying problems within the communities or projects that certain communities are interested in. And I was kind of lucky that I already, since I do have a guiding background and connections to different organizations within the guiding community, I wanted to do a project that I kind of already was a part of. So through that class, I partnered with the Red Side Foundation in a little bit more formal of a research sense of we've done a lot of projects together. But kind of something I noticed, at least while in graduate school, is there's a lot of anecdotes and kind of like
Mm.
individual guide experiences, or like, probably if guides read that paper, there wouldn't necessarily be anything like new or necessarily crazy novel. It's kind of like our lived experience definitely speaks to like what's in that paper. But I wanted to, and with the support of the Red Side, of basically saying that there's a need for this, of basically being able to show through empirical studies that this, like, what are some of these health factors that are unique to guides, and that it's like across the community as a whole. It's not necessarily like, oh, here's Jack Hurdy and Carly talking about, this
Mhm.
specific instance. It's like, what are the common themes that kind of come across this whole collective? But the point of community engaged research is that project. I was kind of ready to do some sort of project that was like on the ground, like maybe doing community training, or I didn't necessarily think that they would want a survey. It's like that probably
Right.
doesn't seem like the most radical thing we could do together. But it was cool to actually hear from the organization itself that there was a need. And since we published that paper, like so many different folks from different organizations and different guides on the ground have like reached out to me individually to basically be like, it's so cool to be able to like cite a paper. It doesn't feel like it's just coming from like me as an individual when we're talking about some of these problems we see or some of these experiences or like grant applications, either even like you're able to like cite this paper that's kind of feels a little more separate from yourself. So that was kind of the hope of that paper, and I feel like it's the first of hopefully others to come. But yeah, kind of just scratching the surface of some of that work. But yeah.
Yeah. What were your kind of your favorite or maybe most impactful findings from that?
Yeah. So I guess the main thing we looked at in that study is like we looked at, different guide access to health services. And we did a very general kind of like guide well-being scale. So this is like more quantitative, and then looked at levels of resilience. And then we also had some kind of, we call them qualitative, but open-ended responses that basically let guides kind of add their own kind of take on like factors they felt were unique to like the guide experience, because like
Mhm.
I feel like most people generally like know general health advice of like, okay, exercise a little bit and eat pretty well and sleep enough and kind of some of these basic understandings without the full context of like what the guiding experience actually looks like. And so I'd say like the main, like, we call it like statistically significant, like the starred findings is like the connection between guide resilience and well-being was kind of the quantitative finding that was important and cool because I'd say like Red Side Foundation and different trainings do put like a lot of emphasis on kind of this idea of like, there's a lot of things in the world and in the even guiding community that aren't necessarily in your control. And so kind of like
Hmm.
what are the access to kind of resources that you have as an individual that can kind of help to more or less like cope or overcome some of those challenges. So I mean, that's like kind of a double-edged sword because that is, it's nice to see that that is the case, but there's obviously a lot of factors of like what goes into someone being able to be resilient as an individual. What does that actually look like? So I'd say there's a lot more follow-up research to come from that. But I'd say honestly, my favorite part is like, I don't necessarily love quantitative surveys alone, just like for numbers. I'm like, that doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. So it
Right.
was just like really cool of like how many folks are willing to like share personal anecdotes and like kind of some of those more qualitative pieces were really interesting. It kind of gave us the bigger picture of, more nuances in the industry itself that is going to distinguish that paper from just kind of looking in like a more general community of like resilience and health, versus like what about our specific sector in this world. It kind of just is able to paint a picture for people to understand who aren't as embedded in our world.
Yeah. Sorry, the dog's running around. Okay, something I think was mentioned in that paper quite a bit is the idea of burnout among guides.
Hmm.
And it's obviously something the Red Side Foundation is really focused on. I'm wondering, based on your knowledge as a kind of psychology and resilience professional, as well as the research you've done and the work you've done with Red Side, what early signals of burnout have you noticed in yourself or peers or subjects of research? And for folks listening, are there strategies that they have found effective?
Yeah, for sure. And like, I'll kind of go into this briefly because I'm like, you could probably do a whole podcast like with a
Yeah.
specific mental health professional. I could go into this in like way more detail. But generally, burnout is kind of this idea of like it's a chronic stress or exhaustion level that basically gets to a point that's beyond just what we call like more acute stress or something that you experience stress and it kind of goes away versus kind of this idea of something that's like a little bit, not a little bit, but more ongoing throughout.
Mhm.
And it's in this context, related to work to some degree, but yeah, signs of burnout of like if anyone like looks at different resources that Red Side kind of gives out of like there's like the color scale of there's like you're in the green versus like in the red is kind of some of the language that they'll use. And so in the red is, you start seeing like pretty serious like mental and physical health symptoms that you're chronic exhaustion, which I guess is like kind of hard to distill with the guiding world because sometimes you do kind of just feel tired all the time.
Yeah.
Signs of more serious like depression, like isolation from friends and family and things like that. And like I said, there's kind of a whole page on Red Side Foundation and stuff. I'm getting into like some of those nuances of what that actually looks like. But yeah, in terms of strategies to kind of like overcome it and what I've seen necessarily work, I think whenever we think about any sort of health issue, like not just necessarily burnout, there's always these levels, right, that you can kind of tackle them. As I mentioned earlier, like there's factors that you can control, like kind of some of these, maybe sometimes more individual or like, within your company, kind of some of those smaller levels. And then there's like these big, scary structural issues that probably
Yeah.
contribute to burnout, like things like financial hardships, or we saw in the paper, like environmental stressors of things like wildfire seasons, like impacting how much
Thanks so
work
much.
people have or like the housing market. Like, I mean, fill in the blanks of like how many scary structural issues there are, which as an individual, you can't always necessarily control. So I feel like a lot of those mitigation strategies kind of end up just being like, what are like put some of these stressors, like first identifying, I guess, like what some of these stressors are like within the workplace, because that's really different depending on someone's guiding context. Like, is it a specific person that you're working with? Is it because you hate turkey sandwiches and like you're getting turkey sandwiches every day and like something that you can like
Yeah.
kind of maybe more immediately control? Or is it like, oh, I have like a really toxic relationship with my employer or with this place, or like, something that like starts to get a little bit more complicated. And then after kind of actually identifying the stressors of like putting those into buckets of like, okay, what are things I can change and what are things that I can't, and what are things that are on me to kind of react to, and what's not, right? Because I think something I that wasn't necessarily, it was talked about a little bit in this paper, but wasn't necessarily as explicitly mentioned as like it probably would talk about, is it's not just on the individual, right? Like when you talk about resilience, it really emphasizes one person being responsible for holding all those
Mm.
emotions and strategies and things. And it does take like a collective culture and ecosystem to kind of address some of those changes. And I'm not necessarily talking about like changing the housing economy as a whole, but like as potentially like an outdoor profession, or a guiding profession, like, what are some things that we can do kind of like from the top down or like as a collective. So that's like the one thing of like resilience can be individual, but like a lot of times you hear people talking about like community resilience and connections to,
Mhm.
their employers and like having supportive environments. So yeah, so short answer, not short answer, is it's very complicated and there's like a lot of different levels to kind of addressing things like health problems in general, but specifically once it gets to a place of like of burnout. Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. There's like, the individual things like I can have a better attitude about turkey sandwiches, but then there's also
Hmm.
the like cultural or organizational culture, like the company you might be working for, or like the kind of group culture of like a specific guiding scene, right? And then there's, larger societal factors that, you know, we can advocate for, but we can't really change. So to
Yeah.
kind of go back to that, maybe those middle levels,
Hmm.
are there things that you've seen in your work of how the outdoor guiding community, outfitters and guides in Idaho, or just writ more broadly across, the West, how they can better support kind of mental health and resilience at that group level, right? Among outfitters themselves, among guides, beyond like this kind of, well, there's Angry August, then you go off and
Hmm.
you travel, but you're getting paid and fun and you're in shape and you're
Yeah.
healthy. Besides that kind of traditional path, like what more could we do for our folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different things. I think first that I think we're already doing a really great job at is just like the ability to name some of these things of like there is so much kind of like I speak mostly I guess from like a multi-day river context in
Hmm.
Idaho. So that's obviously different depending on your specific context. But I do think within our community there's a lot of stigmas of whether that's like not asking for help or not addressing that, like some of these dynamics might be not helpful or problematic or sustainable for guides or outfitters. So I think, like the 7 stages, like the first step's probably admitting that there's like might be a problem or might be something that's not necessarily working, and being willing to not only like communicate that amongst your peers as guides, but having a healthy and trusting enough relationship like with your employers or with your managers that you have a system in place to be able to communicate some of you're the expert of what's going on in your world but also in your crew's world and in the industry's world, and so there needs to be a level of trust but also a system in place to like have those conversations in a candid way and not just a space to, complain about your coworkers, but actually having like tangible systems in place to also be able to address and make changes. And so I feel like the companies and industries I see that are like progressing the most are really actively acknowledging, that like, we a lot of us don't necessarily have like an HR department, but like probably like a company I've worked for a long time, we have like a guide representative who is basically a guide on the crew who is designated to basically help speak voices to like
Mm.
issues or scenarios going on like on the ground that they can help communicate to management in case like a person didn't feel comfortable or have whatever is going on, like so just like even steps like that of like it shows that they care. I've seen like outfitters that give like end of season surveys and let people kind of anonymously talk about things that are going well and that they really appreciate and kind of room for improvement. And so even having like an openness for feedback like demonstrates to guides and outfitters that you care, and vice versa. It gives the guides a chance to like really, I mean, for me, I've been able to tell my outfitter that I really care about them and I appreciate like the context of like what they're doing. And I see like, and just having those processes in place, I think can kind of just like help smooth out some of these like contentions. Cause like some of the biggest things I feel like is just like when you don't understand like why something might be happening, like a health issue an interpersonal drama, like without having that space to actually be able to talk about it, you can't necessarily fix it.
Hmm.
And then obviously, like, I mean, still plug of like putting resources into organizations that are there to support too, like the Red Side Foundation or other training modules. Like there's a lot outside of the Red Side. So looking for things like that to also support when, we all have, especially within Idaho, sometimes like strapped resources in terms of like staff and what we can do like at an individual level. So
Hmm.
or IOGA, it's like having a collective, definitely more strength in numbers and support. So
Yep. Yeah, I definitely believe, we're stronger together, right? Just because I think, mentioned us there, it's one thing I've said before is like, I think Red Side, when I'm explaining what IOGA does, I'll
hmm
use a comparison with Red Side where I'll say like Red Side is kind of looking after the inside of the guide community, making sure, people have
yeah.
access to mental health care, helping them, with some financial resources sometimes, other things like that. Like the wellness fair they do at the Rendezvous is awesome.
hmm
And
Yeah.
IOGA's job is kind of to like be looking outward and, tackling things, at the state legislature, Congress, or with the agencies, regulations, stuff like that. So I guess my question for you is like, if you could snap your fingers and change, one policy, whether state, federal, whatever, what would that be? What policy would you change to improve kind of the health and wellness and resilience of the community?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be realistic with my magic finger because I think the big thing that I see, I guess, is like access to services and benefits, and that
Hmm.
was like a really big finding in our paper is that a lot of the Idaho guiding community, specifically with the help of IOGA's survey, was looking at the amount of underinsured, specifically health insurance, of amount of underinsured guides in our industry, and that's so real, right? From like an experiential perspective of like, there's been lots of summers that I just had no health insurance, and I'm someone that I like have the resources and the knowledge to be able to do that. And so I don't know if it's like necessarily because of our structure and systems a requirement of employers to provide that, but I think at least like having some sort of policies in place that like acknowledge that there is a gap there, and like maybe it's that, you know I don't it's hard because I'm like, I don't know if we can require outfitters to provide those services, like I said,
Hmm.
but at least some sort of acknowledgement that there's a gap in our larger, broader scope of at least within the states, that is a thing. But I guess a different thing I have seen folks do of like provide stipends. Maybe it's not like fully providing health insurance because like we're seasonal employees and stuff, but some sort of I'd say acknowledgement responsibility in that sector would be really beneficial. But also I've seen some you know, maybe it's outfitters or other, employers, especially, I guess I'm especially speaking to those employers that like do have a lot of resources that have, maybe they own lots of different sectors, like within the guiding space. Like there's some large tourism operations that exist in our world, and providing benefit incentives and things like that. I think that especially if folks have the capital to be able to provide benefits to their full-time year-round staff who are working office administrative jobs, like also acknowledging that like the guide workforce is also a legitimate part of considering some of those benefits and services to kind of help with the longevity and sustainability of the industry as a whole. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a realistic magic wand, but you gave me a magic wand. So
No, honestly, I think it is realistic. I mean, I don't know. I think for a lot of outfitters, it's, they struggle getting healthcare for themselves. So I
right.
understand, the math it doesn't math all the time, but I think
hmm
there are a lot of, you know, I- well, what I'll say is, in the course of kind of our health insurance conversation that IOGA has been engaging with, and I think and Red Side's been doing it for a lot longer, but, we've kind of looked into some maybe innovative ways to provide health insurance, whether that's like doing it through the association and like bundling the whole industry together. We
hmm
haven't quite figured out the best way to do that, like
Yeah.
100%, and to, in a way that would be affordable for everyone. But I do think we made some progress. I'm hopeful that in the next few years, like solutions will kind of come together. There's definitely some companies out there that are, like It's not just outfitting and guiding, right? It's the whole country. They're dealing with expensive health insurance costs. So there are a lot of
Yeah.
businesses out there that are trying to like figure out how to provide those services in a more sustainable ways. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I think you're spot on with your diagnosis and your solution there. And fingers crossed, in the next couple of years, something will materialize. And that's something
Yeah,
I
well,
definitely.
I was just gonna say I definitely, like, see and appreciate the work in that space too that IOJ is already doing, so, yeah, that's great.
Cool. Well, we've kind of covered all my questions in some way or another. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you want to talk about?
Let's see. Um, I don't necessarily think so. I'm sure we can keep chatting. I was like, there's a million rabbit holes. I feel like I can go down and
Yeah.
probably see my notes, and I'm like, I probably don't need to go down these rabbit holes today. We'll save another 20 minutes.
Yeah. Well, we'll just have to have you back on in a few months to talk about where things have gone. Will you be at the rendezvous in May? People have questions
I
they want to
think
talk to you
so.
more.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And if not, yeah, definitely my email. You're happy to share that out with folks. And yeah, always excited to think about like projects or like how like the research space or like any of this stuff can like apply like I said, like on the ground of whether it's like trainings or thinking of
Hmm.
yeah. So happy to chat and brainstorm with folks about that.
Cool. Yeah. All right, folks, you heard it here. If anyone needs their health insurance or their the health, wellness, resilience, anything in that space, if you need it solved, give Carly a shout.
Yeah, any of it. Yep.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you get back to it. I hope you enjoy your not weekend. But
Yeah.
thanks for coming on here, and we'll chat soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Jack.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us this week. And thanks to Carly for the great interview. If you're an outfitter on the Nez Clear or a member of the North Idaho chapter, we look forward to seeing you next week. Along with the folks in Salmon, we're looking forward to coming and hanging out with you and watching some wolf howling next week. Also, just thanks to all the outfitters and guides who are in the field working hard, sharing our incredible state with people who would otherwise never have the chance to fall in love with it. It's the work that you do that just makes future advocates for these public spaces that we all love so much. If you have any questions, please reach out with comments or suggestions for future episodes. If you like this episode, subscribe, tell your guide, outfitter, or just friends who are interested in, I don't know, what we do, which would be weird, but that's fine. But most importantly, if you're not a member of IOGA, please consider joining. It's the support of our members that allows us to continue our efforts advocating for this community. See you next week, maybe.